We just didn't want to give the panelists a final opportunity. Audience and I an opportunity to ask any unanswered questions. Maybe the panelists have questions they want to address to each other. I thought I would kick things off by asking a question. And my question has really two formulations, one of which is a softball sort of formulation, which is simply, why should we still be reading Adam Smith today? What is it that you would say to some skeptic who said Adam Smith wrote over 200 years ago, and what's the continuing relevance of Smith today? The more specific formulation of my question actually is focused more on the science of economics. And I hope to have a chance to fill out the details of this question a little bit more specifically, but I unfortunately didn't have time to do the final research. I believe it is the case that a past president of the American Economic Association, I think it might have been either Gary Becker or George Stigler, in a presidential address to the American Economics Association, basically told economists, you shouldn't be reading Smith anymore. And I don't think this was an arbitrary decision on his part. I think it reflected his perception that economics was the closest thing to a natural science in the social sciences that exist, and just as natural scientists, a physicist, for instance, would not go back and read Newton, read Principia to be a good practicing physicist, because Newton has been superseded by Einstein and others. And so you might avocationally have an interest in going back and reading Newton if you were a physicist, just because you're kind of interested in the history of science or the history of physics. Similarly, as an economist, you might go back and read Smith avocationally, but not necessarily vocationally. And indeed, reflecting that fact, the history of economic thoughts is no longer a requirement for most majors, but is rather an elective. So I'm wondering both what we might say generally as to why we should read Smith, but maybe even particularly why is it the case that the science that economists should go back and read Smith? What has been lost in that decision? And I would assume even non-economists might have some response to that.
Well, Maria, you and I are the two professional economists.
Neither of them has read Smith in a long time. That was clear.
Do you want to go? Or
Sure. Maybe I can go. There are different ways of answering the question, why I read Smith today, and why I read Smith today in economics in particular. And one way of approaching this is the standard economic discipline has reached some dead ends. And so what I think it must have been Stigler that said there's no point in reading Smith because whatever good is in Smith has been incorporated into today's model, and whatever made no sense to Smith, there's no point in studying because it's wrong. So that kind of approach, which was more typical of the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s, reached the dead end. And there is a fairly good awareness of the fact that the complete isolation of economics was sterile. And so now there is an increasing, I think at least, or I hope, there is an increasing opening of economics to other disciplines. And experimental economics is one of those fields that is becoming more and more popular. And it is a field that more or less opens to other neighboring disciplines, psychology being the first one of them. And I don't think it's by accident that if you just look at citations, the number of citations of Smith has been increasing constantly in the last couple of decades. But interestingly enough, what has been increasing are citation from theory of moral sentiments rather than Wealth of Nations. I think because theory of moral sentiments give us a picture of human being that is missing in economics. And so when you run experiments, you run into actual behavior, not just theoretical behavior, which may actually contradict the theory. And so you have to figure out, how do I explain the fact that my results are different from what the theory expects? And so you're searching for explanations, and it's easier to find explanation in Smith, theory of moral sentiments, than in neoclassical theory. So it is true that Smith is not read officially, but it's also true that he is sneaking back in different ways. So I think that theory of moral sentiments should be read again, or for the first time, by economists, because it gives us a broader picture of human beings that can help us better understand economic behavior. Why should we read theory of moral? The Wealth of Nations instead? Probably because the Wealth of Nations can still teach us, if seen as a whole, as a package, humility. And so the way I understand the Wealth of Nations, at least, is more of a work in humility, that we would like to see the world in a certain way, but it's not necessarily the case. We would like to have certain kind of results, but it's not necessarily the case. So our wishes and our models and our results are not always a perfect match, and we have to accept the fact that there's not much we can do to force situations in our molds. And so I think it's a good reminder that humbles our arrogance. And so this is why I would encourage economists to read Theory of Wealth of Nations. And for Theory of Moral Sentiments, I would encourage economists to read it, because we still can learn a lot from it. It's an understudied book in the discipline.
Yeah, I think some economists are reading Theory of Moral Sentiments, especially the field of behavioral economics and experimental economics, but I think most economists, they're trying to marginalize history of economic thought out in general and discrediting it and that sort of thing. My own position is there's different ways to do economics, and I do economics more as a branch of social theory. And so with social theory, it's like, okay, what can Smith tell us? Okay, what can Keynes tell us, right? But most economists don't do it that way. And there's also methodologically, of course, the economists, they think that they are scientists as the natural scientists, although I don't think they really know anything about, say, modern physics, but they think they do. So the methodology of humanists, philosophers, and political theorists, it seems to me, and you see this at this conference, is basically textual analysis. Okay, what did the person say, and how did we say this, and how do you interpret it? In the economics, in particular in the social sciences in general, the basic methodology is a model in various types of models. So, for example, Maria is the only one here who does both, right? She has doing textual analysis and the models. So Maria has her feet in both fields. But, yeah, the idea that, economists should really study these texts, most of them, at least where I am, it's my school, it seems economics is getting narrowed down more and more, so that a generation ago, whole fields are like discredited, and at the very top universities, it's like, oh, you wrote in this journal, oh yeah, such and such a journal, that's the #1 journal in the field, history of economic thought, but that doesn't count, right? So there's that kind of stuff. So history of economic thought being discredited, economic history being discredited, not so much. Comparative economic systems, not hardly taught. In labor economics, labor relations, not being taught. So on the one hand, there's discontent, I think, since 2007, 2008, with the dominant paradigm in economics, but I think on the other hand, it's just going. It's just going. So I guess I'm more pessimistic. Although I don't think we really disagree, right? Are you?
No.
Yeah.
No, the discipline does tend to go in a certain direction, but I think that because the direction is a dead end, there are more and more people that are recognizing the fact that you need somehow to...
But for example, courses on Adam Smith at graduate school or history of economics, they're gone. You can study them at certain heterodox schools on the left and right. So like at George Mason, you could study Adam Smith, and they do public choice theory, and they're more on the right. New School, UMass Amherst, you can probably take courses in Adam Smith there. But it's only these courses. But a course on Adam Smith taught in any of the mainstream departments or any Ivy League school, I think. As far as I know, the last course taught on, and I keep asking people teaching at Yale, what department are you in? Because I think the last course taught at Yale in the economics department at Adam Smith was like, either there 1989 or something. I don't think they haven't taught it since then. It's gone, as far as I know.
If I may add one more thing about why I like to read Adam Smith today. So, as Spencer mentioned, at least for economics, we're becoming more and more specialized. So an economist works on, say, labor economics, works basically only on labor economics, and if you present them with a paper on international economics, they say, oh, that's not something that I do. So because of this increasing specialization, we're becoming more and more expert on a very, very narrow field, which is great because it increases our knowledge of that field. But Smith tells us specialization works, or division of labor, specialization works only if you trade. So you need to have,
exactly.
Otherwise you're left with a pile of pins.
Hey, you talk to economists. It's like they don't understand the division. They don't understand the division of labor.
But eventually, I think that you realize that you end up with a pile of pins, and you do need to trade with the neighboring disciplines, and I think that because of this very deep specialization, becomes very difficult to talk to other disciplines. And reading somebody like Smith that was not affected by these very strong disciplinary barriers allows people from different disciplines to find a common ground. So that's a reason for which I would encourage not just economists, but everybody to read Smith, because it's a meeting point that allows people from different disciplines to start to talk together again.
That's a lovely point.
I'd love to hear from the non-economists
I'll just,
the need to read Smith.
Yeah, I'll just speak to the wealth of nations and the history of economic thought issue. When I think of the wealth of nations, I think of it as a sort of gigantic painting, like those. Is it Lorenzetti, the good government, bad government? Yeah, it's like a sort of magnificent painting of commercial society, and you can sort of look at this part of it and that part of it. And it's dated in some ways, but you can learn a lot, and a lot about good government and bad government. And I think in that sense, it's just good to read Smith. That's kind of when I go back to the Wealth of Nations, I find myself with having that experience, looking at a different part of the painting and seeing why it's interesting. As to the science of economics, if nothing else, the financial crash, just should have alerted economists to the need to get a sense of history, at least, what happened more than 10 years ago. And secondly, I guess a sense that one thing I think lacking in contemporary economists is a sense that many of the big issues have been around for a long time. Supply side versus demand side, those kind of things, they've been around for, since Mandeville and Smith and so on. So it would be very good for economists to, reacquaint themselves with a sense of history. And I just add one little footnote. I've been doing some work on business schools and the history of business schools. And one thing that's interesting about them, the first iterations of them, was the role in which political economy played in the education of, was thought to, hoped would play in the education of businessmen. I thought it's occurred to me that today there are all sorts of classes on business ethics and these sorts of issues, especially after the financial crisis. But I kind of, one, doubt how effective those are, but two, maybe reading Adam Smith would be a very good thing for students in business schools to do, and to get us, to get a sort of balanced perspective on the life they're leading and the various tensions and so on. It might be a much more natural way to educate them than to force them into a business ethics class, which they all hate.
So I have just a philosopher's answer to the why read Smith, and that I read both The Wealth of Nations, Theory of Moral Sentiments, but in general, the stuff I do in history of philosophy, I look at beauty, insight, and opportunity, and started working on Hume ages ago because when I read Hume, I found a very stunning view, deeply insightful, and very different than what I read in the secondary literature. And so I felt like I had beauty, insight, and opportunity. There were things I could say about what Hume was doing as I saw it that was people hadn't appreciated. And I think there's sociological reasons for that within philosophy. And I feel exactly the same about the theory of moral sentiments. There are a few superb people who've been writing on it. 2 out of 8 of them are here or something. And there's a lot of things in Smith that I think, people haven't appreciated yet. And I think it's absolutely stunning and full of insight. So speaking to philosophers, you two, okay. Why read Smith? Well, I think it's stunning, insightful, and hasn't been fully mined by a long shot. But I also love the answer that it's a point of contact for philosophers, economists, political theorists, that gets the terms of trade into a common coin.
I mean, students like reading Smith. I mean, it's really, you can do a lot of stuff in meta-ethics and moral psychology and stuff that is really difficult for them to grasp and relatively technical, and you need to do a lot of experiments and stuff. And here you have somebody who is actually an armchair psychologist, but very, very perceptive, actually, in certain ways. And the stuff that you get nowadays from moral psychology is far, far less insightful, I think, than what you have in Smith. I mean, seriously, they're just doing the trolley experiments thousands times over, and they get
A lot of dead, overweight people.
I know. Which you shouldn't
I hate
push.
those
You shouldn't
I know,
push
but they
them.
keep pushing them.
So in any case, there's the attractiveness of his style, I think, which just makes it. And Adam Smith is still a name, so to a certain extent, it appeals to, at least on the undergraduate, to economists and other people. And it allows you to think about how exactly to conceive of rational agency. And I think that's something that is actually presupposed in an economic model. And I think actually Amartya Sen actually appeals to Smith, especially in light of that, of criticizing the reigning model of how to think about rational agency. And so I think there's systematic reasons for doing that too.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add, for me, the question as to why read Smith is a subset of the question of why read anything in the history of philosophy. And my own personal view is that you read it because there's something to learn from it. Philosophy is a fundamentally dialogical enterprise, in my view. And to argue for a position is to argue dialogically. You have to look at the strengths and the weaknesses of the competing views and slowly marshal a case that yours is the best. And in that spirit, you know, a lot of intelligent people died. And but what they said still can be extraordinarily illuminating. And, you know, is Smith one of those? Like the rest of you, I think he is. But, you know, the proof is in the doing of it. But as a matter of fact, entering into a kind of conversation with him, kind of, because of course it's through his written texts, is, I think it's immensely rewarding philosophically in terms of finding the truth of issues that really matter. Starting with these big issues about the viability and the commendability of modern commercial liberal society, but also including an amazing range of other issues. One of the beauties of Smith is that he addresses so insightfully so many different issues, and then somehow brings them together, from, you know, religion, issues of normativity, to rationality, to critique of social institutions, and so on and so forth. That's an amazing synthesizing mind, also very deep. So I think, you know, really well worth the effort to understand all issues of influence to one side. But just because we can learn philosophically from them.
I agree with everything that's been said.
I thought you were going to say, I don't really think he's worth reading. I don't know what I've been wasting my time on these.
I made a mistake. Ex-president of the International. Whether I'd be strict. I agree with everything that's been said, and I think it's good for people to read Smith. That said, I do worry a little bit about lots of people reading Smith and not reading him well. That is, all of these things that have just been mentioned are all undeniable attractions. He brings in a tremendous amount of interdisciplinarity. He provides a locus for conversations for people to get outside their narrow boxes. He says a lot of things that resonate with a lot of different people. He's also a very big name. It's very politically charged to talk about him, and a lot of people want to appropriate him. One of the dangers that comes when any philosopher starts getting read by popular audiences, as Smith has for a long time, he can be easily appropriated, easily manipulated, all these sorts of things. So I think in some ways, while I can't help but welcome the fact that Smith reaches and touches large audiences, there's some, in teaching Smith, it's particularly important to make sure both texts get taught, an appreciation of the capaciousness of everything that goes into it is taught. We resist the temptation to use excerpts to further particular agendas. I mean, one friend always says, you know, Smith giveth on one page and taketh away on the other. And so it's very easy to manipulate Smith to get what you want out of him. So I can't help but be glad that people are reading Smith, but we want to do everything we can to make sure, especially in our education of our students, that we're reading Smith well, and we're reading him exactly in the dialogical spirit that Charles mentions, in the way of a locus or a place where just have interdisciplinary conversations that Maria mentions. But it's not easy. You can't just pick up a text and do it. So.
Anybody in the audience want last chance to get some unresolved issues about Smith?
If I could ask another big general question, if we don't need to start circling a little bit closer, but we started off by talking about Smith and Franklin, and we had this, it was a sort of interesting claim about Franklin as being an American sort of take on Smith, and so my question is, all right, so America is a place where people usually think has adopted Smith in some parts wholeheartedly, at least the sort of Smith's economics. You guys have painted a much more complex, a much more varied picture of Smith, and I wonder if what you would say Smith, this more complex Smith has to say to America, whether there's something to correct, whether there's something that this other part of Smith has to teach America, or maybe on the other side that there's nothing Smith has to offer that Tocqueville hasn't already offered in some sense. So I guess what does Smith have to? What does this broader Smith have to say to America? I guess is the question. America in the 21st century.
Tim won. Were you the one who brought up Benjamin Franklin? Yeah. You basically spoke to this.
Yeah, I talked already, so.
Yeah. One of the caveats on my talk today was that Smith was not talking about a democracy. And I think you've got to be very careful, this is along the lines of what you were saying, maybe, of applying Smith to a democratic situation. And there's kind of a natural experiment that happened after Smith in France. After the revolution, one of the I think I mentioned Say in my talk also this morning. One interesting thing about Jean-Baptiste Say was he's a dedicated follower of Smith's, but he looked elsewhere for models for his, trying to figure out how to run France after the revolution. And interestingly, in this sort of somewhat strange moral work that he wrote just before he published the first edition of the treatise, he looks not to Smith as a source of morals for post-revolutionary France, but to Benjamin Franklin. So I'm on Tim number one's page on this issue that there are limitations to applying Smith to a democratic situation, and Tocqueville, Say couldn't look to Tocqueville, but I think he would have looked to Tocqueville as a guide if that had been possible.
Can I say something? Okay. I think America shouldn't only read Adam Smith.
What?
As much as I like Adam Smith. But I think one way, what's important to understand in Adam Smith is that there is a conception of dignity behind all of this. I think that gets very much lost in just thinking about economics, and that provides us maybe with a critical perspective. That said, I would put Adam Smith together with Marx and Hegel and see how that develops. I think there's something to be said, not being American, but coming from a more Germanic tradition, there's something to be said for the idea that we have to understand power relations, and we have to understand how dignity might be realized only in light of the regulatory agency of the state, and that the state is not just an arbitrary imposition. And those kind of thoughts, I think, are not necessarily within the liberal tradition of Adam Smith. And so, yes, you should read Adam Smith, but not to the exclusion of the more social tradition of Hegel and Marx. That's just my radical thinking there.
We'll take care of you later.
Maybe not the right thing to say in an Adam Smith conference.
So, we're not supposed to think of philosophy as blood sport anymore, but I do like it when people argue with each other. And I feel like yesterday we sort of left off a possible issue that we could have sort of gone back and forth about, which is freedom or autonomy. I take that Professor Griswold's point or criticism was something to the effect that it's very hard to reconcile Smith to the Rousseauian critique, precisely because it says so little about what an autonomous sort of moral agency would look like in the kind of economic systems that of which he seems to approve, Smith, that is. But then, of course, Professor Stover, you mentioned that you thought you could actually recover a fairly substantial theory of agency or something in Smith. And so I was wondering if you two were more to sort of duke it out for on that sort of question.
I give up.
Smith on
the issue of dignity that came up, right? And how exactly you insofar as I see Smith not just focusing on the kind of face-to-face encounter, but the encounter of the individual in his environment, I see, and when he gives the quote that when I agree with another person's opinion, I do it only insofar as I can reenact and simulate that opinion in my own mind. I think what he has to mean is that I can agree with the reasons for those kind of opinions. And so if you put this all together, I see a kind of, it's basically a conception of rationality that, however, integrates the emotion there, right? I mean, so it's not just our rationality that is pure logical, but it involves also the appropriate reaction to this kind of environment. So you can criticize your emotional responses in certain ways, and that, I think, it's open-ended. I mean, I think I think what you don't get in Smith is the idea that we definitely know what autonomy kind of means here, right, and now, because we always have certain biases in the manner in which we conceive of autonomy and what it means to be equal to each other. So I think he's aware of that there's a historical dimension to our discussion. And so there's no absolute standard. The impartial standard is not absolute, but historically contingent in a certain way, but we always have to appeal to impartiality. So if you think about the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, we appeal to a certain kind of standard of impartiality and equality here. Those kind of standards themselves seem to be justifiable a priori in light of this kind of negotiation between rational agents. But how exactly you interpret that is obviously something that needs to be reflected on, because I think Charles is right. We always start out with a certain historically conceived conception of autonomy and equality, etc., that might be challenged itself in light of new scientific research, in light of the interference of a certain kind of political class, etc., etc. So I don't think there's any absolute standard except kind of these kind of abstract ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that we really disagree.
Right.
Sadly, I may not be able to offer you the ballot that you so desperately seem to want. But I mean, I guess there are two issues that for me are very much, I'm in the issues that are very much alive in sort of the matter of Smith interpretation. And yeah, one is, so he doesn't have a Kantian theory of autonomy. Maybe we can agree on that. That machinery just isn't there. So it's some conception of agency, which obviously he does have some conception of agency, something like autarky, some notion of self-governance in accordance with the perspective of the impartial spectator. That seems pretty clear. But what exactly that comes to is what is at issue, I think. So in the face of a kind of Rousseauan, or it could even be a Marxist critique, because of things that Smith says, it becomes unclear just how free, if we could use that language, which strangely Smith doesn't really himself use, except I think very, very rarely in this non-political context. It's unclear how free the impartial spectator is. I mean, how free the rational agent is. So there's kind of one, I think, still very undecided issue there. And, like Jeff's comments today about the impartial spectator inheriting, if I could put it this way, a set of maybe prejudices, I don't know, maybe sort of traits, psychological traits, such that, psychological pain is more salient than physical pain. And there's all these strange perspectival limitations that are built in, and then there are these remarkable Smithian passages, including one in the passage that Ryan was talking about, where Smith talks about the need to appeal to God because the appeal to the impartial spectator isn't working, because the impartial spectator has gotten carried away by the applause or disapprobation of the ordinary spectators. So you have to go one notch up because the impartial spectator is not being that impartial anymore. And that seems built into the impartial spectator too. So that really complicates the whole issue. So there's that whole problem that I'm feeling very unsettled about still. But there's also this other question, which is, what level of, positive liberty, to use Berlin's phrase, is necessary, according to Smith, for a just and free society. People have talked about that a bit, and there's obviously some threshold somewhere. But where is it exactly? I mean, I guess another way to put it would be, how much virtue really do free and rational, politically free and rational agents need to have, according to Smith? I mean, I have the feeling it's relatively low threshold, and that is itself one of the points of debate between people like him and people in the Rousseau through Marx through Frankfurt School tradition, like Honneth and other people are arguing. They seem to be thinking you need really very high level of education, rationality, virtue, and agency to have a good, free, democratic society. And hence great words about alienation, objectification, a whole set of social pathologies that decrease the capacity for agency. Maybe part of Smith's argument is that actually they don't really matter that much politically, and therefore they're not really on his radar past a certain threshold. Just a thought. So it seems to me that problem is still there.
I mean, I think I share exactly the perplexity about Smith's relative silence in discussing freedom in this way, especially if you put him next to Rousseau or Kant. But then maybe this is just the perversity of teaching Smith now after having been teaching Rousseau and Kant for a long time. I wonder if there might not be more of that there than it comes on its face. And if we wanted to find a teaching on autonomy, it wouldn't be in the impartial spectator, but it might have something to do with his teaching on self-command in particular. And I wonder if it's possible to read his theory of self-command as a theory of freedom to some degree. I mean, one of the great perplexities is why Smith cares so much about self-command. What the question is to which self-command is the answer, that's not obvious at all. And he really seems obsessed with it. And it seems to be at least possible that a high degree of self-command is necessary to get you something in Smith like what Rousseau is trying to teach Emile, or what Kant calls inner freedom, the capacity to enable yourself to maintain a certain degree of cognition, rationality, and judgment that without being skewed overly by the more disruptive sentiments. I don't know how far I want to push this because, again, it's absolutely right. Smith does not use the words freedom to describe this, but it does seem to be structurally analogous, that he's really concerned with the same sort of question that I think is central to Kant and Rousseau.
If I can jump in on this impartial spectator, the previous question about Smith and the United States today, it does remind me, it seems to me one of the major problems in the United States today is that a typical white person's impartial spectator and an African American or a black person's impartial spectator, they're not seeing the same things, which is another way of saying we still have a very big racial issue problem in the United States. Certainly this comes up with different trials that we've been seeing and elections and stuff, so that, a white person's impartial spectator is not the same as an African American as a general rule, I don't think, in this country. And oftentimes not even close.
So I wanted to go back to the self-command thing for a second, because one thing that strikes me as a trajectory, and I think Charles referred to this in his talk, was if you go back to the Republic in Book 9, where there's the defense of what Socrates is calling justice, which is being ruled by reason, which is a matter of having the capacity to ask, answer, and act on the question, what's worth doing. His defense there in Book 9 is it's only if you're like that that you're genuinely free. And then there's a debate. Is the argument, if you're like that, then as a consequence you'll be free? And if that's the style of argument, then he would have a bad answer to Glaucon's challenge, because he would have shown justice is good only for its consequences. So it looks like his argument is what freedom really is being a just person. And that's a matter of being able to think about what's worth doing, not just finding yourself pushed and pulled in different ways, and having the self-command that lets you pursue it in the face of contrary pressures. And I find that same view very much in Kant. So when Kant picks out what a rational agent is, it's an agent who has the capacity to act on their representation of something as good. And then true freedom is not just having the capacity, but succeeding. And I think of Smith as having that available, but not focusing on it.
Can I ask about self-command? And because I read the ancients as, and Kant and the ancients very different. So in Kant, the rational autonomous agent is always able to suppress his desires, right, in the right way. And so you get always the critique from German idealism, Schiller onwards, that doesn't seem to be a healthy state of affairs, right? It's basically you're free when you repress, push them down. Now in the ancients, in Plato and Aristotle, I always see it's not so much suppression, but
Harmony.
this harmony, right? So the emotions and desires are tamed in the right way. So you're reasonable because you don't want the unreasonable. But in Kant, you always want the unreasonable, and you have to suppress that. So he's very Christian in that sense. Now, so how do you see the self-command in Smith? Is that more harmony or more suppression? So I was.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So other many fine readers, TMS here will correct me, but I'm just thinking out loud here. When Smith gives examples of self-command, it tends not to be. It's not just self-restraint or something. It's not just tamping down on desires from drink sex. It's not that sort of repression. It's rather command of one's reaction to misfortunes, not going to pieces and crying over Maria's Band-Aid issues today, paper cut sort of thing. That sort of thing comes up again and again in the discussions of self-command. If that's what really matters to him, then it might look more like the first one that you're describing here, which is what matters is having the maintenance of an emotional state that allows for the sorts of rational judgment that the impartial spectator demands, rather than the sort of grinding down, tamping down on all the deep, dark desire sort of thing. That's sort of instinctively. I'd be curious to see if other people, I mean, maybe I'm forgetting the very important parts of self-command, but that seems to me what Smith leads with, at least.
To me too. That's why it reminds me of the Platonic and
So
Aristotelian
what I want to
ideas.
ask is, so now, as wheels are turning now. So thanks. So personally, I'm really grateful for this. I've been starting to see the contradictions a lot. What I want to know is how he maps onto Hume on this particular question, because it seems to me that maybe here is one of these divergences. But I don't know if you have a thought on this that you want to.
Lauren had to listen to a whole paper on this recently. So I do have views about how Hume appropriates the idea of a rational agent, or not Kantian rational agent, the capacity to act according to your conception of what's good or right or virtuous. But in Hume, almost all the focus is in Book 2 on liberty, and there liberty is basically freedom from restraint of what one wants. And that, so I can tell us, in Hume, I feel like I can tell a story of how it's available to him. But like both Hume and Smith, I think it's not their focus. So we're reaching with self-command, or we're reaching with the capacity for normative judgment. But I think it's in there.
But I mean, in Hume, it sounds as if desires can't be reasonable, right, in some sense. I mean, it's in light of desires that we can achieve something. And the only way that we can judge desires is maybe in terms of maximizing.
So I think the general point of view plays a role, almost exactly the same role that the impartial spectator plays in Smith, of helping to constitute the capacity to think in normative terms about what you desire.
Then there is but then it seems that you read Hume not as Humean as he is normally taken.
Right. This is one of those cases where I think everybody thought Hume is a non-cognitivist. His motivation arguments
interesting,
established
yeah, right.
that all you do is act in the basis of your strongest desire. I think that's a deep misreading. I think he had as a major part of his project making sense of our making moral judgments, not just liking and disliking things.
But then how do moral judgments motivate?
So to the question you asked in your paper, parallel question with Hume is, why should we care about what is approvable from the general point of view? I think Hume's answer is structurally isomorphic to his answer about concern for justice. So his story about justice is we face a salient shared practical problem of working together in ways that are mutually advantageous. And once we establish a certain convention, there's motivation for each of us to comply. I think that regulating our thought and talk and action by the general point of view solves the same problem. So you get in book 3, in the talk of the natural virtues, he starts to give you the argument for the general point of view, which is basically the resolving of the constant conflict that comes from not having a shared standard. So it's a light version of Hobbes. Life is full of conflict until we can pick a way to talk together about shared problems. Yeah, but it is one of these readings that's not widely shared.
No, but
yeah.
Can I throw something into the table here? Sorry, I haven't been able to attend all the lectures, so I'm not sure whether this has been raised at all. In the context of the value of Adam Smith and his legacy for America, the question of the apparent racial divide regarding the impartial spectator. I don't know whether any of you during this conference has quoted a remark in which Smith says that he thinks that happiness is about equally distributed among different economic classes. At the same time, that as I think more than one of you indicated, he really was concerned with elevating the condition of the poorer classes. Clearly the remark about happiness being equally distributed would apply only in countries like 18th century England or contemporary America, in which in fact the general standard of living is quite high. There are obviously many countries in Africa where it would be very hard, and people are on the verge of starvation, to make that claim. But it strikes me that this relates to the issue of what he meant by self-command. That Charles, rightly, I think, suggested that on the whole, in your talk yesterday, Smith's influence is probably more salutary than that of Rousseau, precisely because part of the kind of Smith self-command that I think Smith encourages us to have is that you don't spend your time consumed with envy of what other people have, especially if, as I think is empirically true, it is not the case that people who have 1,000 times as much wealth as the average person are even twice as happy on the average. As I often say to my classes when I'm citing Aristotle's account of the elements of happiness in Book 7, Chapter 1 of the Politics, and he says that most people think that happiness is chiefly dependent on external goods, but they're wrong. It's chiefly a matter of virtue, intellectual and moral. If Aristotle is wrong, how come people in Hollywood spend so much money on shrinks, and so much more than the rest of us do? And especially that even in the case of what is, of course, an actual major racial divide in America, in terms of economic and other well-being, which may have a good deal to do, I think has a great deal to do with the breakup of the family in the lower class in America, although not only there. thinker has been to encourage a spirit of envy. If other people have more than I do, that must be making me unhappy, and it's unfair. Smith, I think, espouses a more realistic account of the human condition in which it's foolish and silly to spend your time complaining that although thanks to free enterprise, you're a heck of a lot better off materially than the people of most parts of the world. Other people belong to the 1%, and it's just not fair. In that respect, I think Smith, I would suggest, encourages a healthier outlook on life, something that would make most people happier. I'm reminded of a chat I had with a fellow next door who owns a small business in which I was expressing my revulsion at the lavish amounts of money people spend on bar mitzvahs, which I find personally revolting. And he, being a small businessman, said, yes, but think of all the people those bar mitzvahs are providing employment for. And he wasn't, I don't think he's ever read Adam Smith, but I think he was making part of Smith's point. And so not only should I not spend my time, which I don't, envying people who have more than I, but I shouldn't spend my time feeling revulsion at people who waste money on corporate jets and all the other things that's become popular to envy, because for somebody else flying a corporate jet not only is not making me worse off, but is actually providing employment for a number of people who would otherwise not be employed. And in all these respects, I think Smith, even though he wasn't writing specifically for democracy, he's offering a generally healthy outlook on life, which would be desirable if we could inculcate it in more of our students.
I might say something about that, since it sort of touches on some of the themes of my talk this morning. In general, I would agree that and this was the thrust of my talk, that for Smith, inequality is not a big problem. It's only a big problem in particular cases. So I agree with that, and the sort of general thrust of your comments. The difficulties I have and the caveat that I introduced about democracy comes up in a number of ways, and to some degree I agree with some of Spencer's comments today. You also find in Smith, accounts of how wealth and imitating the wealthy can be corrupting. So there's that in Smith, but more to the point, if you take Say or Tocqueville as a guide, democracy works best when there is a kind of equality. There are a few rich people, but there's a lot of turnover. Something that's quite different from Smith, all professions are honorable, regarded as honorable. No one looks down on the butcher as they do in Smith, or opera singers, or so on. There does seem to be, some requirements in those regards necessary for the smooth functioning of a democracy. I just say one last thing. That book I mentioned by Piketty that just came out, it's a gigantic book about the history of wealth over sort of several centuries. The only bits I read in the book so far where he talks about Jane Austen and Balzac, the non-economic parts. But the point of those, why I included those sections in the book is that he uses them as illustrations of societies where the only way you can get to the top is, hard work doesn't get you to the top, but social climbing, strategic marriages, a little bit of criminality, that's how you get to the top. And so I'm not as dire, my outlook on the present situation is not as dire as Spencer's, but if there was this kind of entrenched inequality, that could be very corrupting for a democracy.
But Smith shows precisely how to prevent that.
Yeah, that was the other part of my talk. So I'm not as I said, as gloomy as Spencer, because I see many of the trends as recent trends in inequality as just produced by just sort of strange circumstances, but bad policies. And if we got rid of the bad policies, there'd be less inequality, more economic growth, more equality. Everything would be rosy again. Or as rosy
Again, where are you reaching back to? Yeah.
if it ever was rosy.
Yeah.
So most obviously, to restore the integrity of the family. That is to say, if
Well,
we didn't have such a high percentage of children being born out of people of all races, without stable two-parent.
That was my other caveat this morning.
Who stick together at
Right.
least until the kids leave for college. That will make a big difference.
Any other questions? Or
Just one more thought I think that has come up through, in the course of our conversations, which is, I think Smith also leaves us with a very interesting question about the extent of our communal agency, the extent to which we are capable of guiding our communal lives. At some level, he himself, of course, is trying to do this by publishing these books. But of course, part of what he's saying in these books, and I think here the historical narratives in The Wealth of Nations, is that we are irremediably passive to the course of things. Brian talked about one of these passages in TMS, but you think of his account of the rise of modern liberty, or his account of the demise of the Roman Catholic Church, which seemed, at the time, as he narrates it, the latter impossible. This combination of spiritual and temporal power could never decline, and yet it sort of did in ways that nobody could foresee and nobody could prevent. And this is a kind of a frightening picture in the midst of all of this talk about agency and so forth, of lack of agency. And I think it's one of the most interesting and, it's been discussed, but still sort of puzzling and perhaps insufficiently explored parts of Smith is what happens to our agency given this kind of philosophy of history, in the context of which there's not that much agency. And, every time you try to exercise it, there's this sort of unexpected, counterintuitive, sometimes destructive to you result that happens. How do you act as a historical agent or as a political agent given this view? And I find that a deeply troubling and also very, very interesting problem. You mentioned the issues of the environmental issues. I think is a kind of a way of pressing this point. What do we do in the face of the scientific facts of the matter? Is acting in light of those facts actually going to help? Is it going to harm? Should we proceed on our jets and so forth, and in some way that we can't imagine are going to create a technology that solves the problem that we never thought of, or not? What do you do? And I think Smith is very, very troubling in that regard.
Sorry, can I add to that? Because that was the point I was trying to make before when I said that to me, reading Wealth of Nations is a teaching of humility, because we are humbled by what surrounds us. And so Wealth of Nations is a story after a story of attempt to do something and then it doesn't work out.
Right.
At least in the original plan, whether it is, Wealth of Nations is mostly at the macro level. But I don't see it as troubling. To me, it's a good thing that Smith tells us, hey, don't be so constructivist in a sense. You're not so capable of changing the world. So you're just like a part of it, but you're not able to redesign it according to your plans. I don't see it as a troubling.
And yet, as Spencer was saying, we're facing these potentially cataclysmic consequences of our own pursuit of wealth and luxury, namely, the destruction of the atmosphere, the rising of the oceans, and all this stuff that is happening. So I agree with you about the humility point, a very Smithian thought, critique of the man of system, and all that. And yet we're facing these really...
Crap is happening and you're telling me we can't fix it.
Right.
Yeah, and that's, yeah,
Efforts to do it may make it
worse.
worse.
Yeah.
But
That's a frightening thought.
the gentleman was asking about the distribution of happiness, not of income or not of wealth, right? And Smith has, to me at least, a very interesting description of what makes us happy. And the attempt to change situations that cannot be changed are going to make you miserable. And so, forgive me, I forgot the exact details, but there is like a queen or a princess or some noble woman whose husband died, and the priest keeps telling her, if you keep praying, your husband will come back. And she keeps praying, and then she's miserable because her husband will never come back. And on the other hand, a count, I think, was in prison, and he realized that he could not escape from prison, so he finds happiness in feeding a little spider. And because he accepts the fact that he can't change that situation. So I think that there may be something to it in recognizing that, yes, there is global warming. In part is our fault, in part may not be our fault. There are things that we can do, but there are things that we may not be able to do. And so there is luck that comes to play that we tend to diminish, I think, in the United States in particular. And Smith instead tells you, well, there are a lot of things that happen with luck, or bad luck, or good luck, whatever you want to present it. So I'm not saying that you should just sit passively and accept everything that happens to you, but on the other hand, you should also recognize the fact that there are certain things that are bigger than you and you cannot change. Or you at least...
That's one reason why I think Smith himself appreciated the role that religion would play in people's lives in helping, making it possible for us to accept these things.
As I tell my students, one of the things about Smith is he's such a clear writer. Almost every sentence is very clear. And you think you understand it, but then it's like, wait a minute, what about 500 pages ago? How do these two sentences, they clearly seem different? Or what about Wealth of Nations and Theory of Moral Sentiments, right? So, for example, the division of labor, page 1, this is a great thing, but by the time you get to book 5, we got some big problems with the division of labor. Similarly, with happiness, Theory of Moral Sentiments, it's pretty clear. It doesn't take much to be happy. You can sleep under the bridge and this kind of thing. But in the Wealth of Nations, the way population is kept down is your kids die if you're poor, right? They don't high child mortality. So, I mean, that's one of the puzzles or challenges or joys or griefs or whatever of studying Smith, is try to figure out how all these things go together, if they do. As far as the specific thing, I think to myself, fortunately, because I'm ignorant of physics, I suppose, it's like how hard can it be for the government has invented the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, we put a man on the moon. How hard can it be for this government or other governments to invent a battery that, solar battery that holds the sun and the heat and can transmit it? Apparently the physicists say, oh yeah, it's a huge problem, blah, 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 but you put someone on the moon, how did that happen? The atomic bomb, how did that happen? Well, it was the government, right? So sometimes you need a government. Ancient Egypt, they figured out, hey, look, the Nile keeps flooding. If we could, somehow manage it, the Nile, then we'll be the richest country in the world, which finally happened.
Are those anecdotes from TMS, the anecdotes you told about the spider and so on, they're in TMS? Where in TMS?
We're looking at you, Ryan.
Where you got it from. Book 3 is where it's Count Lauzun, the story of taming the spider, although I would give it a little bit less optimistic tinge that I'm not sure Smith is so celebratory. I'm trying to remember which is the Spanish queen that was being brought back.
But it's next to the spider.
It comes in the same.
Yes. So both in book 3?
Yeah, I'm almost positive. We'll do the search.
I'm just wondering whether this relates to what Jeff said in his talk. I mean, that utility is really not the standard for the evaluation of individual agency, right? I mean, all of our actions will have unintended consequences. We have no control over them. And it would be kind of nonsensical to take them into account in asking how we should act now, or how we should judge another person acting. So in some sense, we have to be adapting a certain kind of humility towards those kind of consequences. On the other hand, that doesn't release us from the responsibility of being proper or acting in a way that deserves merit. So, but those kind of standards are kind of different, right? So if you would be completely utilitarian, then all of these long-term consequences might have a relevance for the evaluation of your action, but they really don't. So I mean, I'm just wondering whether that was one way to think about it.
Yes. I was just going to say, it seems to me one of the key challenges of practical wisdom to try to decide which way to flip here, so that the only way you're going to make real differences in the world is by overestimating what you might accomplish and not giving up and not. On the other hand, banging your head against the wall is key to unhappiness and a waste of time, especially because you can do other fruitful things. And there's, I have a good friend who's worked incredibly hard to make something happen. It looks like it's going to fail, and part of the admirability of her efforts was how hard she worked, and then part of the crucial counsel is at a certain point to show that the failure is the product of group failure. That you can't do this all alone. But I think that's a really hard challenge to make that. So I'm not comfortable just feeding the spider. But I'm also, I think in department life, when you're trying to make your department better, sort of working hard in the recognition that there's a lot of, free riders, and there'll be less free riders if you work hard. All of that seems to me an important part of life. But it is this switching back and forth rather than figuring out where the line is. This is helpful for me thinking about my friend and how I'm going to counsel him. Yeah. Spend your time on this. I'm sure you can feed the spider. It just depends on you and the spider.